I'm so glad that we had some time to chat, and especially after this last 2 years that we did so much over Zoom. So, if with great pleasure that now I open the session 3, Contextual Factors in Resilience. I would like to invite the chair, Benjamin Shaw from the University of Illinois, Chicago, to chair the session. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chicago. Really honored to be part of this group, which I haven't been part of before, but I thank you to Flavia for the invitation. And really excited to introduce you to this next session on contextual factors and resilience. We have 4 great speakers, and beginning with Arturo Vargas Bustamante, a professor of health policy and management at UCLA. He'll be talking about older undocumented immigrants. Then we will turn to Stipika Mudraja from the Urban Institute, Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute, who will be talking about the role of place in Alzheimer's disease among communities of color. Then we'll turn to Lisette Piedra, Associate Professor, School of Social Work at UIUC, talking about caregiving and its influence on social networks over time. And then finally, Mariana Lopez Ortega, researcher in medical sciences from the Institute of Nacional de Geriatría, talking about the experience and the costs of family caregiving. And then to round it all out, we have a great discussant. Since I've been hearing so many stories about the days of being emerging scholars, I'm going to just share one quick one of my own, which was probably my first GSA over 20 years ago. And I remember sitting in the lobby with my mentor, Neil Krauss, and a couple others, kind of late at night. And Dr. Marquez, we didn't know each other, approaches and says, "Hey, does anybody want to go out for a nightcap?" And without even thinking, I just raised my hand. But then I looked around and nobody else was raising their hands. None of my mentors, they were all too tired. So Dr. Marquez and I, he went out, just the 2 of us, for a nightcap in San Francisco. And it was so memorable. And just I'll always be thankful for how generous Dr. Marquez is in his time with junior scholars, and what a role model he is to the field. So I really look forward to hearing him as well as a discussant. So anyway, first up, Arturo.
So good afternoon, everyone. I think I was the lucky one to keep you awake after lunch for the next 15 minutes. I hope that this topic will be interesting enough for you to be mentally sharp. So first, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And today I'm going to be talking about the state of older undocumented immigrants and their health. How do I? Which one? This one?
Yep. So, but wait, let me click out of it now. Sorry to be.
No worries.
I'll make this. Oh no, it should disappear, and you should just be able to.
Oh yeah, great.
That, and then ignore those. I'll be interested.
Okay. Sounds good. So I will present in 2 parts. The first part of my presentation will summarize some basic facts about undocumented immigrants in the US. Particularly, I'm going to be focusing on the aging process of undocumented immigrants and what are going to be the consequences in terms of health and healthcare coverage. And in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to be focusing in California, the state where almost 1/4 of all undocumented immigrants in the US lives, because it has been an interesting case study on how to expand coverage to the undocumented. More recently, with the expansion of Medi-Cal, that is a Medicaid program in California, to undocumented immigrants 50 years of age and older, with projections to include everyone. And I will conclude my presentation showing some projections about the uninsured by the year 2024. So if I want you to get something from this presentation, it's going to be like 4 things. And the first one is the knowledge that undocumented immigrants in the US are actually kind of, like, the number is kind of stable, if not declining. The population of undocumented immigrants reached a peak just 15 years ago in 2007, when it reached a maximum of 12.2 million people. However, since then, after the Great Recession, the number it declined sharply, and then it remained kind of stable, if not trending down. And by 2018, that is an estimate that is like the most reliable recent. It has been estimated between 10 and 11 million people, depending on the predicted on the technique that you use to estimate this population. So undocumented immigrants in the US represent approximately 23% of all US immigrants. And then the second fact that I want you to get from this presentation is that the way that they concentrate geographically is very important for us to understand. First, because they tend to concentrate in few states. Almost 63% of undocumented immigrants live in 6 states only: California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. And 81% lives in 171 counties. Yes, still the majority of undocumented immigrants in the US are from Mexico, 43%. However, it has been almost a decade since the number of Mexican undocumented immigrants has been trending down. Number one, because of immigration enforcement, increased deportations. And number two, because of demographic changes in Mexico. Not that many Mexicans are available to migrate. So the new arrivals of undocumented immigrants in the US have been likely to be more for Central America and also Asian countries. Another very important fact that I want you to get from this presentation is that in the last 15 years, the population of undocumented immigrants in the US has been more likely to be longer stay. What do I mean by longer stay? Well, those undocumented immigrants that have lived in the US for more than 10 years. You can see in this chart how in 2005, pretty much the population of undocumented immigrants that was have lived in the US for more than 10 years or 5 years or less was kind of like comparable, 38 versus 36%. But since then until now, it has the longer stay population has almost doubled, reaching 66% of the undocumented immigrant population just by the year 2018. So, well, why is this happening? Well, there are two trends that explain this divergence. The first one is that net immigration to the US is actually going down. In spite of what you see in the news, immigration in the US is declining, particularly sharply since 2016. We know because of home, right? And then the second one is that in the early 2000s, after September 11, immigration enforcement increased in the border. So this essentially brought circular migration down rapidly. What do I mean by circular migration? Well, in the past, immigrants used to come to the US, they worked many years, and then sometimes they went back. Many times, they went back to their home countries when they were old or when they got sick. So this essentially eased the pressure of aging undocumented immigrants in the US healthcare system. However, now that circular migration has declined sharply, undocumented immigrants have by far more incentives to stay in their country and to grow old, to settle here, and they will need health, and they will need healthcare. So right now, the problem is not too obvious. Only about 10% of undocumented immigrants are either 55 and above. However, this population is aging rapidly. And even though they are not yet in that cohort of older undocumented immigrants, the undocumented right now in, let's say, like a middle-aged state are also at higher risk of having worse health. I recently did some data analysis with a California Health Interview Survey, and I found that twice as many undocumented immigrants, 33%, ages 65 and older, reported fair or poor health compared to US-born citizens. And only 29.3% reported very good or excellent health compared to 54.2% for citizens. And this is, this population, again, is not more likely to be older right now, but it will be. And right now is also less likely to have health insurance. About 44.6% of undocumented immigrants lack health insurance in California, compared to 9.2% of US-born citizens. And this is not exclusive of undocumented immigrants. It's, on average, all immigrants in the US are aging. And I like to show this graph because it compares the cumulative percentage change of the US-born and the foreign-born population. And you can see that, yes, population aging is happening in both. than the native and the foreign-born population. However, for those cohorts that are 50 years of age and older, the population growth is by far much faster among the immigrant population. So what's going to happen in the next decades in the US if present trends continue? If we don't increase the number of young migrants coming to the US, well, the US healthcare system will be pretty much unprepared to deal with a population of aging immigrants. And this is, the healthcare system will be really pretty much unable to deliver optimal care, not only to undocumented, but also documented immigrants, because a lot of actually legally present immigrants do not accrue the 10 years that are needed of Social Security contributions to be eligible for Medicare. Also, and undocumented immigrants have been are excluded from Medicare nationwide and from Medicaid in most US states. So for these immigrants that won't be able to get access to Medicare or Medicaid, poor access to care will continue to exacerbate health inequities. So what can we do to address this situation? Well, since the 1990s, when the federal government pretty much said, I'm not going to take care of immigrants, they essentially shifted the responsibility to the states and local safety net providers to expand coverage to this population. And California, that is home of a quarter of all undocumented immigrants in the US, started to innovate in different ways of expanding coverage to this population. It began with some limited health plans like Healthy San Francisco, or by shifting safety net providers into medical homes for the uninsured, just like My Health LA. And more recently, California was one of the first states to expand full scope coverage to low-income undocumented immigrants under the age of 26 in the year 2020. This year, actually, it expanded it also to, just a few months ago, to older undocumented, low-income undocumented immigrants, those who are 50 years of age and older. And if the plans continue as right now are expected to happen, next year, 2023, all the remaining ages that are not yet eligible will become eligible, those who are 26 years of age to 49 years of age. If this budget appropriation that is right now being discussed and approved by California's Congress, if this happens, then by the year 2024, all low-income undocumented immigrants will be eligible for full scope medical. So what are the main changes that are going to happen after 2024? Well, we expect that California will see further reductions in the number of the uninsured population. You can see in this graph that just after the approval of the ACA, the share of the uninsured dropped drastically from 13.8% in 2013. It went down to about 7.4% in 2016, and it has remained relatively stable there. But those who remain as uninsured adults in California are mostly Latino. And among this population, my colleagues at the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research have found that it's mostly undocumented, and those who are ineligible, who are eligible but do not enroll in medical employer-sponsored coverage or the exchanges. So the projections are, if the state ultimately is able to expand full scope medical coverage to all undocumented immigrants, it's estimated that the number of the uninsured will drop from 3 million people this year up to 2.3 million people by 2024. However, it is important to state that this is not necessarily going to close the coverage gap. This is, again, it's a great achievement to cover low-income undocumented immigrants, but some research that I have done recently has estimated that about 1 in 4 undocumented immigrants will remain above the coverage threshold. So undocumented immigrants, not everyone is under the 138% federal poverty level. So for those who are above the federal poverty level, they will continue to struggle to get coverage. But they are more likely to have employer-provided health insurance and health coverage from a relative, for example. They will continue to lack options to get affordable health insurance coverage. So for this population, the state will need to continue to find ways of including them and finally be able to reach universal health coverage in the state. Well, that's all that I have for you. I hope that we have a conversation during the Q&A. Thank you.
Things little bit slow. Let me just change the settings for you. Yep, there it is. So you just need to go to the next slide by pressing that one, and then you go back by pressing that one.
Okay, hello everyone. If Arturo successfully kept you awake, I don't know if I'll be able to follow in his footsteps. I may just put you all to sleep, but then again, maybe some of you like to sleep a little bit after the lunch. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk about this topic today. We've already heard a bunch of great presentations in the morning sessions, and there are many more to come later in the day and tomorrow. The one I'm going to be focusing on is the topic of the role of place for brain health equities among communities of color. And this study was really meant to be just a first step, laying some groundwork for the work that is to follow, and some of which is ongoing. So what you're going to see is some very basic descriptive results that hopefully will still be somewhat insightful. To start with, we know that there are millions of people in the United States who live with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, their number is projected to grow substantially over the next few decades. African Americans, as well as Latinos, are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and related dementias than non-Latino whites. So when this is combined with the fact that the population of older African Americans is expected to double and older Latinos more than triple by mid-century, that tells you it's pretty easy to do the math how explosively the number of older people of color with Alzheimer's disease is going to be in the coming decades. We also know that where people live is anything but random. But the research, with some exceptions, some of which we heard about, examples of which we heard about in the previous sessions before the lunch, this research has been relatively limited. So in this analysis, the focus was really at looking how social determinants of health are related with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias at the county level. A little bit of a background, we know that social determinants of health, things like education, income, food, insecurity, state of physical environment, are among the key influences of dementia risk. There is a growing evidence that dementia risk can be modified by brain healthy behaviors. It's been already mentioned that the findings from the Lancet Commission, for example, suggest that managing certain risk factors, things like hypertension, diabetes, obesity, could prevent or delay about 40% of dementia cases. And from some data that was mentioned by Dr. Vega, this also seems to be potentially a conservative estimate. This number may be even higher, or at least higher in some societies. In this analysis, I use data from Medicare fee for service data, supplemented with the data from the census, as well as county health rankings, which is basically this. Can think of it as repository of a lot of data from various sources at county level. Admittedly, the sample was arbitrarily chosen as top 25 and bottom 25 counties with respect to highest and lowest prevalence of Alzheimer's disease for Latinos, non-Latino, African Americans, and whites. Even though the sample was arbitrarily cut at 25, once the same analysis was repeated with top 10 counties or expanding to top 50 counties, it didn't really move the results one way or another. As I said, the analysis was descriptive in nature, looking at demographic and health profiles of counties with the highest and lowest prevalence among racial and ethnic groups of interest. Now, demographic and health profiles, I won't be showing them today. I'm going to focus in the interest of time on modifiable risk factors and socioeconomic correlates of Alzheimer's disease. So here are some results. So when we look at the what I call lifestyle-related modifiable risk factors, so things like diabetes, obesity, physical inactivity, smoking, insufficient sleep, we can see that African Americans, that's the left figure here, we can see pretty clear differences in the prevalence of diabetes, obesity, physical inactivity, smoking, and a little bit less so insufficient sleep in counties with the highest prevalence of Alzheimer's disease for African Americans, as opposed to those with the lowest prevalence. For Latinos, the trends are the same, but the differences are smaller. Switching to environmental modifiable risk factors, what is really dramatic is the difference in the access to exercise opportunities, especially for African Americans, but for Latinos, almost the same. So huge differences in the proportion of people who have access to exercise opportunities. That means, parks, built environment that is providing opportunities for people to have some physical activity. Also some difference in the food environment, basically availability and accessibility of food. So we are talking about the concepts such as food deserts, who lives in food deserts, who can afford healthy foods, etc. But arguably, the most dramatic difference in the socioeconomic profile of counties with the highest and lowest prevalence of Alzheimer's for African Americans and Latinos. We see that with respect to levels of education, but also all other indicators, household incomes, percentage of families living in poverty, those lacking health insurance. So pretty drastic difference for both African Americans and Latinos. Now, turning to non-Latino whites, how do they in a way compare? First, when we look at lifestyle-related factors, we see that whites also, those who live in the areas with the highest prevalence of ADRD, also are much more likely to have to report higher rates of diabetes, obesity, physical inactivity, insufficient sleep. So not that dissimilar, from other groups from people of color, but then. Other than, we already see with environmental modifiable risk factors that the difference in the access to exercise opportunities is smaller. between the areas with the highest and lowest prevalence of Alzheimer's. There is admittedly, somewhat higher difference when it comes to air pollution. And then most interestingly, other than educational attainment, there is much other than educational attainment, there is actually much less difference in the socioeconomic profiles of the counties with the highest and lowest prevalence of ADRD among non-Latino whites. So basically, what other research shows and what this preliminary descriptive research tentatively supports is this notion that where people live matters. Among African Americans and Latinos, what we find as some of the most important factors are lower levels of educational attainment, lower median household incomes, lower rates of physical activity, less access to locations for exercise. In comparison, among non-Latino whites, the most important factors seem to be related with higher rates of diabetes, obesity, and then physical inactivity, sort of a common element, as well as to some extent the educational attainment. So those are some of the common factors for across all groups. Furthermore, as we've seen, research does suggest the importance of modifiable risk factors in curbing Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And so there are a bunch of recommendations, things that we could and should do based on this and other findings. And that is to contextualize Alzheimer's data with social determinants of health data to be able to better target solutions where they are needed most, to improve the surveillance of Alzheimer's disease and monitoring efforts with a focus on geographic hotspots and high-risk populations, including many of the areas where people of color live, to invest in economic opportunity to promote brain health equity, but not only directly as it relates to health-related infrastructure, but also more broadly with respect to economic supports to disadvantaged communities, and something that is sort of near and dear to my heart, given that a lot of my research is dedicated to caregiving, to promote policies that support economic opportunity and resiliency in communities, such as paid family and medical leave, because we need to be aware that in addition to rightfully focusing on people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease, it is also their family members, their spouses, children, and other family members who carry that burden with them. So finally, I already hinted at some of the next steps. So we've been working on getting some additional high quality local level data, especially those that are that have been less used previously, including those on the availability of various health services and even nonprofit organizations that provide health-related supports at local level. And also, we are currently making some efforts to combine or to use this data alongside the individual level data from surveys such as the HRS in particular. First of all, because HRS already has some interesting measures of Alzheimer's disease, including some developed by Melinda Power and her lab that is adjusting for racial and ethnic differences, and also to focus on some of the less studied issues, including prodromal and or preclinical Alzheimer's disease, and how it may differ by geography and by race and ethnicity. And with that, I'm gonna conclude. So thank you.
Okay. Oh, let me just go get my USB with your PowerPoint on it. 1 second. You have it on a USB? Let's try this one and see if it. I have it on a USB too, but it's always. No, it seems to not. It seems to say it's. If you have yours, then let's try yours instead of mine. Oops. Sorry. Sure, I deleted it. Oh, yes, I think I did. Thanks. Sorry about this. I had it there ready to go. Doesn't seem to be opening. Which one is it?
It's the top one. Yeah.
That one. Excellent. So I'll just share my screen. And then we want to do this, don't we? Oh, I'm pressing. Where is it? Oh. All right, so just to move forward, you're going to use the arrows like that. So that one's forward and that one's back. I'll move that out of the way. Thanks.
Okay. All right.
All right, thank you for your patience. We had technical difficulties. My name is Lisette Piedra, and I am so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to talk about social networks. This study came out of a diversity supplement that I have with the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. They were very interested in taking what is a very well-known study for older adults. It's a longitudinal study, and beginning to ask questions about how can we learn more about the minority populations. Usually they're something that you control for in the analysis. And so mine was to look at specifically Latinos. I want to just thank my collaborators, James Evanuk and Linda Wade, who have been very instrumental in encouraging me to do this kind of work. So I'm just going to give you background that you already know. We know that Latinos 65 and older are growing. We're expecting to grow to be 15 million. Compared to other groups, they have longer longevity, but they also live greater periods with diminished health. You know this. This is actually really bugs me. It bugs me for two reasons. One, because I do believe that this is completely modifiable. And it's not modifiable through medicine. It's actually modifiable through what we do in our environment. But the other piece that really is troubling is that so many people who work with Latino older adults, whether they're the community health workers, whether they're the older adults themselves, are not aware of this. So when I mention it to them, they oftentimes are surprised. What, really? It's like, yes. So there's a greater need for caregiving resources, but a lot of the resources, a lot of the caregiving takes place within the family context, within these networks. So what are social networks? So one of the first things I did was sort of just learn about this sociological part of the literature. And I have a social work background, so this was really foreign to me. Social networks are everybody who we're surrounded with, it's our family, it's our friends, it's the people we work with. You watch somebody on tenure track and who they choose to be with and how their social networks are constraining and shaping their behavior. And so we're very much creatures of context in this. So here's a picture of Latino social networks. The analysis that have been done with them is that those networks tend to be dense. They tend to be very family centric, but there's also data that's beginning to show that as you get later in the life course, that Latinos are actually interested in having relationships with their with their neighbors, with their communities, and so they actually become less family centric over time. But in the aggregate, it looks pretty traditional and family centric. When I looked in the literature, and I'm like, well, who's done research on social networks and Latinos? There really wasn't a whole lot. I came across two studies. One is the Feinberg and Hammer study, which they looked at 48 Latino older adults, and they did one day they interviewed them on one day, and they said to them, okay, who do you interact with today? Like, and who are your people that you talk to today? And so that gave them a sense of the size of their network, people who they talked to, who helped them with their groceries, who they saw down the street. And then they looked at, how much reciprocity was in it, and how much interconnection there was within the people. And what they found was that the stronger their network was, the more it was linked to whether or not they had medical needs. So people who had stronger networks were less likely to have medical needs. And so this is one of the few studies that begin to look at that the networks that you're embedded in actually seems to make a difference. This study took place in the Upper East Side in New York. And what was interesting to me about it was that this is a pretty homogeneous sample. So you've got people from a particular community, similar ethnic backgrounds, similar age group, but you're having this variation of health outcomes that's related to their network. So I'll give you a little bit of social context, of history of the social context and how it relates to resiliency. So a lot of, for the sociologists in the room, a lot of the interest in social context really started when disengagement theory came up with the idea that as you get older, you become more socially isolated and disengaged. That was Cummings and Henry. And people were like, well, wait, that makes no sense. You're stripping aging from the social context, and it loses the question of, well, what makes people resilient and connected as they age. And so you had people becoming much more interested in continuity theory and activities. It's the activities and the way you continue your identity as you transition over the life course. And that grew into people becoming interested to what extent are you integrated in society and remain integrated as you get older, and its associations to health. And that eventually became part of this idea of looking at people's social networks. If you revisit the Hammer and Freidenberg's study, denser networks are more efficient. There's a lot more opportunity to have membership surveillance with somebody. If you have contact with your neighbor and you see that all of a sudden your neighbor's not there, or you might be inclined to knock on their door, so you have more access to surveillance. However, there's a flip side to that. It might interfere with privacy and support. So there's usually, with a lot of good things, there's usually a flip side to it. And so I say this because there's a lot of ways of measuring social networks. And so as I got into this literature, I thought, oh my God, my head's gonna explode from all the different caveats that contribute to social networks. And so I sort of settled on this literature. It's not new literature, it's been around, but Howard Littman and a lot of his colleagues said, well, wait a minute. It's not just these different aspects of social networks that are important, but it's actually the sum of these things, the constellation of these things that tend to serve as sort of resource worlds. And so they did there's a series of studies that they did in the United States, partly with NSHAP, partly with other, but they've also done stuff in Europe. And so there's been a lot of international studies, and they tend to settle on about 3 to 5 network types. So the idea is that they take sort of these different aspects of networks, and they try to figure out, well, what sort of category of network do people fall under? And so one is that it's a restricted one. So you're just connected to the people that you know very closely. They tend to be family. You're not really involved in the community. You don't have a whole lot of friends. And the restricted type tends to be a lot more, having a lot more health problems. They're restricted, they have less access to resources because these networks serve as conduits of resources. And then they found sort of a series of enriched networks. So networks in which you have lots of friends, or you might have lots of family, but you're involved with different family members. And, or you have an enriched network with this congregates. It's sort of been based in a religious community. The fifth one was a diverse network. And a diverse network is where you have lots and lots of different kinds of relationships with different kinds of people. And the diverse networks were associated with greater health, cognitive health, longevity, all kinds of really good things. And so if you think about it in the range of like restricted being the one that seemed to be associated with more problematic people versus the diverse range, I started to wonder, well, I wonder what it looks like with Latinos, because doesn't seem to be a whole lot about that. And so I also started to see that there's, networks can change over time. Our networks change as we change. And there's two sort of theories in sociology that sort of speaks to that. One is the convoy, that, we have a group of people, and as we change, that convoy changes. And so that as we get older, a lot of times we become, our close ties become very family centric. They get to be smaller. The other one is the social emotional theory, which is the idea that you also begin to develop, their ties are smaller, but they also tend to be more meaningful. And so these are two theories that suggest that as people get older, we can expect that their social networks will change. So this study, we decided, well, let's explore whether the social network groupings change by race or ethnicity and how they vary for caregivers. And we wanted to see, well, what is the characteristics of these networks? What are the characteristics of our participants? Do they change? And does being a caregiver make a difference in these networks? The methods that we used data from 3 rounds of the National Social Life, Health and Aging Project, NCHAP. We had 6,489 respondents. We used the latent class analysis to identify groupings of social relational characteristics. And we used the multinomial logic to predict class membership. Can you see that? We can. We used 3, oh no, really? She just told me I had 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna speed this up. We used 3 measures of networks, their structure, their function, and their quality. The structure, we looked at, they have an important matters name generator, which helps us get a sense of who there is in their network and how that functions. We used, whether there's social strain and how often they're interacting with people, and then whether or not they experience loneliness as a sense of, well, what's the quality of it? Doesn't matter how wonderfully structured and high functioning your network is, if you feel lonely in the midst of it, there's not really a whole lot of quality there. Across all the rounds, it was pretty, the numbers were pretty similar, which we expected to find. We looked at sort of the characteristics, and again, we were just looking to see, are these numbers pretty similar from one round to the other. I just want to speed up to find our results. We came up with a 3-class solution. We found, a restricted class with overall low social connectivity, an enriched class, and a diverse class. And so these were just sort of what they were pretty much in the same number of people, and we had moderate stability. So people tended to be in the same group. More than half were from round 1 to round 3. What we found is that the likelihood of being an enriched class, which is sort of the in-between one, if you were a caregiver, that was more likely to be the case. The other thing I would like to bring your attention to is that, and I forgot to highlight the one for African Americans, but you were less likely to be in an enriched class if you were African American, and more likely to be in an enriched class if you were Hispanic. When we looked at change of class composition over time, we found that whites were most stable. Black respondents went from 51% in the enriched class in round 1 to 37% in round 3. So what you have is a decrease. representation in the other two classes increased. Hispanic respondents go from 26 in the diverse class to 40% of representation in other classes declines. This is actually for Hispanics, it's actually a good thing. And for African Americans, it's actually almost what I expect. What I didn't expect to see was I didn't expect to see this with Latinos as well. I mean, to see the opposite with Latinos. These are vulnerable populations that are clearly being responsive to their context in a way that other groups might not be. And when we looked at class composition by whether the respondent is a caregiver, we found that they were more likely to be an enriched class. And so the question really becomes, because there is movement in these classes, what is it that we can do, at the community within these networks to help them move into a more diverse, that gives you much more resources. But the fact that they're in an enriched class, being a caregiver in and of itself does not mean it will be a compromise in your network, which we found interesting. Over time, context-specific factors may be contributing to network resiliency among Hispanics and network vulnerability among African Americans. A better understanding of these network shifts would facilitate a development of policies and interventions for aging populations. And I have a limitation slide because as we were and this is very exploratory for us, we were just trying to come up, take a look at what is it, how does these networks work with this population? And to my disappointment, the Latino sample was too small to consider specifically Latino caregivers. And the other piece that that came out is that oftentimes when you look at social networks, you don't have a sense of how people themselves are navigating those networks. You don't get a sense of their personal agency. But you also, at least with this data set, you don't have consideration of the diversity of Latinos. And in particular, at the very basic, you don't have the inclusion of language. And this was actually really hair-raising to me and my colleague when we realized that what MSHAT has done is when you look at Hispanic, you're really looking at both groups put together. There is no control for Spanish language, and the Spanish language variable had not been made publicly accessible. This actually mattered because we were doing another study where because when you don't make something publicly accessible, it's not brought to the attention of scrutiny, or it's not subject to scrutiny. And so it's easy to miss problems. And so this is one of those missed problems. So when he and I looked at cognitive scores among Latino caregivers, not everybody, just caregivers, we found that Latino Spanish speakers were about 5 points lower than whites. And it was hair-raising because that's an artifact of being a problem with the measure and how it was translated. And so one of the things that we oftentimes don't think about is, are our measures, how were they translated? Were they in this kind of back translated type of thing, or were they actually checked for meaning? And how do they work when you are actually using them at the grassroots level? And so these are things that sort of come up as limitations when we think through the study. And that is it. Thank you again for being here and to letting me present here.
There, isn't it? Sorry, I always think it's just with this. Yeah, just move that out of the way. And then we'll share the screen. Paper. Oh. Yeah, so you just go.
Hi, everyone. So I don't know if the first one of the presentations is the hardest one of the last one for the panel. So hopefully everyone is still sort of eyes open and not too tired. So I was thinking, for the past presentations, trying to remember the first ICA meeting that I attended. I think it was right before I started a postdoc with Bill Vega at USC. So almost 10 years ago, and I don't know if I want to say it, but just to say thank you, Jackie, Cocos, Bill, everyone here. I think I've gone through poster presentation, early scholar, organizing meetings, I don't know how many things, and I really appreciate all of them. And I think one of the best things, at least for me, and I say it with these research collaborations and when you do a postgraduate program, the best part of thing is the people you meet. And I think for a lot of us, well, for me at least, it feels now like a family, not just like a research collaboration or a conference or something. So thanks. And of course, Flavia, for the opportunity to present here today. This is work that's qualitative, really different. So first, I have acknowledgements at the end, but first I want to thank Emily Freeman at the London School of Economics and Rosa Farres at the Mexican Federation, Alzheimer's Federation, because we're doing this work, in particularly the work about the pathways of care with them. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about this project. It's called STRIDE, which is Strengthening Responses to Dementia in Developing Countries. This was a 4-year project, where we had 7 countries participating, including Mexico, 2018 to 2021, but we had a 3-month extension because of COVID, which made life really hard to do fieldwork. The main objective of this very large project, 4-year project, was to contribute to improving care and support systems so that people living with dementia can live well, and that the family carers do not face excessive costs, risk falling into poverty, or compromise their own health. And this project in the 7 countries was carried out in collaboration with the Alzheimer's Disease International Association and with Alzheimer's and other dementias associations in each country. In Mexico, as I said, it was in here where I work. I was a PI with the Mexican Alzheimer's Federation. And this is very important because from day one, we had that contact with people living with dementia and their carers, of course, and what we call stakeholders, like a national advisory group of public, federal and local level institutions that have been with us together in all the process. And this makes sort of research for us with a policy background much more sort of you see where you want it to go. So this, as I was saying, this was a very large project with very different activities, very diverse, from what we call desk reviews, situational analysis on dementia care, which included like, do we have policies, do we do not, what are our services, national level, a SWOT analysis on what, if we want policies, what that could be, but also like field work, and in terms of one I'm presenting in terms of what about care, pathways and costs, the impact of caring for someone living with dementia as an unpaid carer, and also, for example, trying to figure out issues around stigma and knowledge about dementia in our country. So it was very diverse. And just to go right into the presentation, what I want to talk to you about today. It's one of the components, a working package of the project, which was, you cannot see that, but it says costs and impact of dementia care. So this part was, the study aims was to understand the costs of providing unpaid care work for family members with dementia in Mexico, and try to understand the associated economic, social, and health consequences of this unpaid care. So fieldwork included in-depth interviews with people who care or have cared for a family member with dementia, first in person, but of course, when we started, it was 2019. Then we had COVID coming in. We stopped for a while and then realized we cannot stop. So we continued remote doing either video, phone calls, WhatsApp calls, whatever the participant felt was better. So in total, we have 50 interviews with 23 participants. We had one participant lost to follow up, and 2 family members of the participants we interviewed that died, but not of COVID. We did this in 3 localities, Mexico City and Toluca. So because we were doing this in person at first, it was only sort of restricted to that area that we could have time and budget to go. So it was these 2 cities. And then when we went to virtual interviews or online, we were able to do some interviews in the state of Chiapas, which is southern state, much more disadvantaged. So we have 2 urban and 1 semi-urban, because it wasn't even in the capital of the state. So it was very interesting to have this diversity. We have multiple interviews with each participant, couple of hours or more, 3-4 hours, because it was different, as I was saying, different interviews, and of course a wide range of topics. And sort of, I don't know if many of you have done qualitative. I was more of a quantitative person, but doing qualitative lately, and 50 interviews is years of analysis. But so here is some preliminary results. First, at the person, we have like 2. Been dividing these preliminary results in 2 levels. First, a personal level, what we call a personal level, and we have some emerging concepts. And first, I want to talk to you about an emerging concept of feeling trapped. For the participants, that the beginning of intensive care provision for someone with dementia is an event that divides one's life narrative into a before and an after. The after signals the end of freedom to direct one's life. There are no meaningful breaks in caregiving, and there is no way out. So caregiving responsibility is seen or felt as relentless. For example, one participant talks about the constant care for her father. Anytime he's at the day center, then she's cleaning and getting things ready for him. So even when he's not there, he's still doing things that are related to his care. Her siblings don't provide care because he doesn't want to go with anyone else. He just wants her to take care of him. Another participant talks about being in a cycle of caregiving, giving her dinner, getting her in bed, going to see her 2-3 times at night. When she gets up and in the morning, give her breakfast, change her, give lunch, do the housework, dinner. And they refer to, it's like when I was caring for a baby, everything. This same participant, for example, tells us it is very difficult to accept that this is your life. I mean, that everything spins around this, around Alzheimer's, and that even if you have lots of money and you have enough to pay someone to take care of her, or for you and everything, you're always going to be in charge of her, right? It is accepting that your social life has ended, your life, your tranquility. And for example, if you don't get on with your spouse, you say, no, that's not my life. I don't want to do this or live this way. So you separate. But here, there is no way to separate myself. I have to go on here. There is no way to go. Another emerging concept that we've seen in quite a few of the interviews is that of restructured lives. Being the main carer of a family member with dementia transforms lives and plans which have to be changed and restructured. There are no alternatives or no preferred alternatives, and so changes have to be made, even if they bring high opportunity costs and have negative social and economic impacts, as well as an impact on their health and well-being. An example, for example, in Mexico City, this is a participant, he's divorced and he has a teenage son that lives with him. They are from another state in the southeast of the country where his mother and sister lived. However, after not being able to find specialized care for diagnosis or management of his mother's condition, they decided to have his mother move with him to Mexico City and with his son. So besides the changes in having an additional family member at home, infrastructural organizational changes that have been made, he also mentioned that had to leave a directive position for another one where he did very well, to another one that's much less challenging, significantly lower paid, but gives him the flexibility that he requires to take care of his mother. Another participant that lives with her mother until recently, she had a full-time job and a business, a restaurant bar in the city where she lives. But given the care responsibilities, he had to quit her full-time job. She only had the business, but however, with COVID, she had to close. So now she doesn't have that main income. So in this emerging concept, of course, there is an important number, as I was saying, of the participants that have to restructure their life, whereas that means living or changing the city where they live, their job or employment situation, their living arrangements, either they move or having the parent moving with them, but also personal habits that are transformed and that can potentially have a negative effect on participants' health and well-being. For example, all this talk about all this reference to sleep. So even when they manage full nights of sleep, they always refer to, but I'm always sort of, trying to see if I hear a noise. So, it can be sleep, but not restful sleep. They have to be alert all the time. So at the structural level, what have we learned so far? In most of these cases, it's long care trajectories, around 10 years, with a general lack of knowledge about, for these family members, about what dementia is, what does it mean, what does it entitle, what can I expect in 1, 2, 5, 10 years. Normalization of cognitive decline as part of aging, and stigma, very related to that, where people do not externalize changes. Even if they see things are changing, they don't want to talk about it. They prohibit, their or rest of the family members to talk about the condition or associated problems. This generates a great delay in the search for care, and consequently, when people go and sort of seek some at least healthcare or diagnosis or tell me what's happening, there's little margin to act from the clinical aspect of it. And when there is a diagnosis, there's most of the times little or no explanation by health professionals about possible changes or behavior. So, okay, you have a diagnosis, but nothing else. And of course, all these psychosocial factors are really important, but people really don't know even that they could expect them to happen, much less how to manage them. So knowledge and learning or attention seeking is usually obtained post-event. And we also saw, especially in Mexico City and Toluca, a lot of self-learning strategies, such as support groups, going in the internet, trying to find information from Alzheimer's and other dementia associations, from other countries, especially Spanish-speaking countries like Spain or Argentina, South America. Also, a very high impact on family members that have to stop work or change their job, as I was saying. And really now, another part of the project is trying to give this, give it a value. How much is it costing in terms of time and job, either because they stop working or everything that they have to spend on doing all this rearranging in the home context. For example, also for those that had a day center as a support resource, they refer to the pandemic as a relevant negative impact, because now there's no moment of respite. So it has been 2+ years of it was very extreme, and now it's even more. Changes in home arrangements and life course, as I was saying, people migrating to the capital or other places, and the impact on life dynamics. And it has been also very interesting, not even very happy, whenever, I think a bit sad way, for many participants, that they express that in retrospect, I've been doing this 6, 8 more years. There were a lot of things that we could have done. Like, if I knew this was going to happen, we could be better prepared. Or if I had known, I would have made things different. So I just want, before I finish, because I already saw the 1 minute. So just to thank, this project was for the 7 countries, but was funded by the UK's Research and Innovations Global Challenges Fund, and the project was administered by the London School of Economics. So thanks for that. Of course, to all the participants that agreed to take part in the study, and our immense gratitude for opening up to us, because it's really hard. And I was in some interviews and listened to all of them, and some of them are really like heartbreaking. To our fieldwork members, Janira, Jessica, and Rocio, that helped me with the interviews, and the twin translators, because as I was saying, this was based at the London School of Economics, and I'm doing the analysis with a English-speaking researcher. So everything had to be transcribed, translated, read by me again to check Spanish and English, and then the analysis. So if this takes long, doing it in both languages is even longer. So our translators too. To our Strike Mexico National Advisory Group, as I was saying, this group of stakeholders that have been with us for the 4 years, trying to see how to the future, how do we do we put these research results into practice or translating it to something. And to all the Strike Dementia project in the 7 countries and the London School of Economics, because this has been an astounding learning, all the learning and collaboration experiences. So thank you very much.
No, I'm just going to do this so that we can see everyone there. We need to.
Well, hello. I enjoyed the presentations very much, and the whole day has been really fantastic. And I've been part of this conference with Jackie and others from the beginning. And the last couple of years, we were not able to meet in person. So it's really nice to be in person and see all the energy of the group. So I feel inspired, and I hope you are too. I must say that there's a person that is missing, which is my good friend, Steve Wallace, who was always part of our group. He was a very close friend of mine, and I'm just glad to honor him this week by sending to press for the Journal of Aging and Health a special issue honoring his legacy and his work, which will be published probably by January and or February. So anyway, he's being missed really, and very much part of the RICMA world. It's directed the coordinating center there, and definitely missing. So first of all, the undocumented paper was what a wonderful new thing that we've been maybe ignoring forever. And you know, I mentioned to Arturo that I got contacted by USA Today on Monday. What do you know about undocumented baby boomers? And I said, I really don't. I've studied thousands of people over the years, Mexican Americans, but we never asked them about their legal status. But I said, I know a guy you can talk to, Arturo, and hopefully you'll be able to really talk to him and maybe just influence the press to do a piece on this. USA Today, I don't know how many people read it, but it's a lot of people. So anyway, the thing about undocumented aging, we talk about immigrants coming in healthy and then they lose their advantage over time because of behavioral changes, but also because of structural factors and hardships they face. Then you think about people who are undocumented, well, they face a lot more hardships and barriers to their lives. So if you're able to follow them over time, you're going to see that they really decline much faster than other immigrants. And of course, that's something that we need to study more, and it's just hard to do, of course, because of data limitations, but you're doing a great job there. Stipica's focusing on place and Alzheimer's disease. Well, we've been focusing on place and all kinds of well-being in older people. It wasn't really until the 90s when gerontologists and others in epidemiology began paying attention to neighborhoods and the social context. It's amazing how recently that is. Now, social scientists, sociologists, very much talked about the ecological, human ecology systems and so on, but they weren't talking about health outcomes. And so it is a very recent one. It's kind of challenging. You have ecological fallacy problems. Stipica's approach is kind of different, looking at specific areas based on the percentage of Alzheimer's disease in different populations. And he finds some, I thought, interesting findings. The challenge with what he's doing and what others are doing is to go beyond what an individual study can do to contribute and convince us that the context has an impact over and above individuals. And you mentioned toward the end that one way to do what you've been doing and maybe more appropriately is to have a large data set like the Health and Retirement Study and follow people over time and look at incidence of dementia in neighborhoods and populations. Again, it's a very challenging field, but it's something that we do with all outcomes, and it's kind of like creative in a sense what you're doing in that looking at Alzheimer's disease in neighborhood, which is it hasn't really been done very much. We've done mortality, we've done depression, we've done disability, and very other things. I want to move to one thing I want to talk about. Where do these people live? I mean, you talk about Blacks and Hispanics and so on. And then I was thinking, with the Blacks and Alzheimer's disease, are we talking about the Deep South? I mean, the stroke belt. Where possibly some of these Black people live, and maybe even the white people too, who do poorly. So having a map maybe where the people live in your study or a follow-up study, really. And I think you and I talked, this is kind of the beginning of maybe different studies that you can follow from this. So very innovative. Also innovative is a research study of caregiving, and we think of social networks, the social factors as really contributing to caregiving and so on. Now you're talking about how the caregiving process leads to changes in the networks. And I thought that was really interesting. And then you show, of course, that the Latino population is very family-centric and does not benefit from outside networks as much. Now, about caregiving, I just want to say a couple of things about caregiving. Back in the 80s, we were saying that do we need another study of caregiving to prove to the world that it is stressful for individuals. Steve Zarek, the caregiving guru in many ways, wrote a paper. And then there was kind of like a decline and loss of interest in caregiving in the 80s and maybe even in the 90s. And then what happened after that? Well, Alzheimer's disease came into the picture. And NIA started still funding in a big way, studies of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And if you do that, then, one way of dealing with it, because we're not really finding solutions to the problem. What there is caregiving. People have to take care of their families. And so from the negative perspective on caregiving in the 80s, we're seeing people, focusing on the positive aspects of caregiving in all populations, not just Hispanics, which we kind of saw in our recent data with the Hispanic EPIs, but in the general population too. There are a lot of positive aspects of caregiving. And so I know we're talking about resilience, and when we think about the Latino population, the Hispanic the population of Mexico, that are familistic cultures, right? We think of maybe family resilience as something that is a good thing, and then we do not really want to overemphasize that. And the reason I say that is because you overemphasize the strengths of the family. You may deprive people of services that they may need. And I think that your presentation makes that point very well. And Mariana, last but not least, Mexico. There are a lot of people here who know a lot more about Mexico than I do, but I just say a few things about your work. The richness of qualitative data. Really, we ignore qualitative work in many Washington gerontology, but like when I just saw some of the statements up there, how rich that is. And each of those statements is like a hypothesis that can be tested in a larger study. What about Mexico? Well, Mexico is got high life expectancy rising. I don't mean during the pandemic, we all have seen drops. But the other thing about Mexico, obesity is really high too, maybe higher than the US, right? They say diabetes, all of these risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and also poverty in many people. And so I just want to repeat again the issue of caregiving and the positive aspects, but also what happens to familistic cultures, which is a negative thing, the opportunity cost where family members, like you mentioned, family members, women especially, they have to quit their jobs sometimes to take care of people with Alzheimer's disease in their families. And that is a huge thing. It's happening with the Mexican American population too. And it's happening with the non-Hispanic white population. But they can deal with it better because they have the resources, more so than the Hispanics of the United States or Mexico. I just want to end by saying that thank you, tremendous work. There's a lot more to be done. And resilience is a nice concept. Again, I kind of warn not to overemphasize resilience because we might deprive people of the services they really need. So thank you again. Very nice.
We have time for a few questions if someone wants to come up here and ask a question. Don't be shy. We all had lunch together.
So I don't know, it's maybe a little bit unorthodox, but I'll ask a couple of questions of my co-panelists. First, one of the graphs that you showed early on from Pew showed the difference in how long people stay in the United States and how it changed over time. So there are two things there. First, the numbers were not getting up 100. So is it that we don't notice the length of stay for the rest of the people?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it was like less than 5 and more than 5.
Okay. And then the other thing is that the total we're getting up early on from more like 77.5 and in more recent years to 80.85. So I was wondering whether that was sort of a systematic difference or is that basically just accounted by the in between? And then for Lisette, I just had a quick question. So especially when you mentioned the research done by Hal Litvin and his colleagues, and they've done a lot of cross-national work. But I was wondering, so do the implications of belonging to a certain group differ by society? In other words, being in a, let's say, a restricted network in a country like Denmark, where maybe the people are in such network, or there's a better healthcare system, and more so people are more expecting other people to be in that kind of network. They're more accepting of that state of affairs. Is that different from being in such network in a country like Italy, where there's more of the expectation that we would have larger family, that we would be more with friends, and where not having those things can get more of psychological weight on individuals that sort of feel that they're failing in some way by not having those members. So is there any research by something?
No, not that I know of. But I do know that because they're doing it within context, within the country context, so they're comparing people already in that context, and that some contexts you'll see more movement than in others. And so, like some Asian people, right? Like you were in one country, one social type. That we're looking at, and that's already in context. But we don't know the psychological underpinnings. Is that causing feedback?
No, I just want everyone to be able to hear you.
Oh.
Sorry.
So we don't know if we don't know what's the agency behind it. Just looking at Mexico, where everybody had sort of expectations. You still had a group within there that even though they were being critical of family, they were much more because they were so constrained to the family. It's the constrainment that they were more likely to have functional dependency. We don't know if one caused the other. We just know that they seem to go together. And so there's a lot we don't know about those things. So we do know that we are embedded in them and that they are types and they seem to have overarching impact.
All right, well, thank you all for your presentations. So the last presentation actually got me thinking, and I think the question might be relevant to all of you perhaps. So we talked about qualitative data and English and Spanish interviews and focus groups, and how do we account for the indigenous groups in Mexico, for example, or even outside of Mexico, and the detection of Alzheimer's and dementia-related conditions there as well. So if you all could perhaps say a few words about how do we also consider indigeneity in the work that we're doing, whether it's qualitative or quantitative.
So, well, just to clarify, all the interviews were done in Spanish, but then we had to translate it, and then I had to read the English so to make sure it made sense. Because sometimes you do verbatim translations, and you read it in Spanish, Mexican Spanish, and it's great, and you read it in English, and say like, wow.
Right. I noticed that one of the. Sorry, go ahead.
But then just to go to the for the indigenous. I mean, we do not just because part of this project, the whole project, part of it was going into trying to figure out stigma, and we did some. We have some information on sort of how not all the country, but some in some states what the views are about dementia, and and there are some indigenous communities that don't even have a term, of course. I think in work done by the Mexican Alzheimer's Federation, for example, that's not part of this project, but they have been doing things, for example, for a report of the Alzheimer's Disease International and other things. It's what you're saying is very true. I mean, that's cities and probably more, I don't know, urbanized places in Mexico do know the term dementia or probably Alzheimer's, but they just related to memory loss. But then in some indigenous communities, the things it's happening, of course, but then people say even more so than in urban places, probably refer it as the person is crazy. You did something bad in your life, so that's you feel bad if something's happening. So we do need to do much more research if we want to have programs or some policy or something in Mexico, not just with this, with everything. It's sort of, we are so diverse that it's really hard to just refer to one place and then trying to transform.
Thank you to all four of you for your presentations. It was four, right? I'm sorry, I'm have a headache, so I'm like, okay, let's see how this goes. I really appreciated the nuance you were providing, Mariana, on just very quickly on the way in which caregivers have adjusted their lives. So that was very interesting and tough to see, right? To learn about more and how it may differ from caregiving approaches here in the U.S. Or be similar in some ways. It was very interesting to see that the education basically was a major, ecological difference and not relative to income, for example. So that's kind of a point for the people that think that there's some educational true effect of education on cognition at the ecological level, but still it's interesting and consistent evidence with that, I suppose. But I had two questions, one for quick ones, I hope, one for Lisette and one for Arturo. One, Lisette, maybe asking question about basically not exactly the paper you presented, but something that is kind of prior, because you said yourself there's so little work on these kinds of measures. It's super interesting. So I was interested in understanding, see, you can say a little more about how the network, how the three types of networks were created. Sorry, you mentioned it briefly, but I missed a little bit of it to understand how basically the Latino versus African American versus white populations differ, to understand that better, and whether you've looked at how those are related to health outcomes, right? Because they're supposed to, the idea is that protection, sociocultural protection that relates in part to the advantage or the Hispanic health paradox is driven through things like this, through social support. So understanding network structure would be interesting from that perspective. And reminds me of not only the honoring the late Steve Wallace, but also the late Eta Virrell Fuentes here from UIC, right, that did some work on this, for example. And Arturo, the quick question was embedded in your projections. There's some sort of understanding of how the undocumented population is aging differently from potentially the native population or the documented population. So could you say a little bit more about? I assume it's much more rapid than other populations, but if you say something a little bit about that, it would be really interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Those are great questions. I'm just trying to they're complicated questions. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. So we did a link class analysis, and there is lots of literature that shows that. So there is a connection with health. There's lots of studies that were done, and they usually are looking at the networks controlling for Hispanics and Latinos, and then coming up and making the associations with health. So what we did in this one was we controlled for those health outcomes. We know that they're there. We know that we just wanted to see, are these networks coming up, and by using race and ethnicity as sort of our primary thing that we're looking at, as it changed from one round to the other. And so when we saw the shifts, what we're seeing is that, what he did was, what my colleague James did the analysis, so ran the statistics, what he did was he took round and race, and he did an interaction variable, and he put that in. And so what we found is that the likelihood for African Americans in round 3 compared to baseline was that they were going to be less likely to be in a diverse, and that there might be more likely to be in a restricted network. and restricted, if you look at the literature, they are associated with more problematic health outcomes across the nations and in the United States. So, and then for Hispanics, it turned out that, and actually, I'll be honest with you, I was sort of expecting to see that they would be like African Americans, more restricted, but it turns out that they actually become more diverse and becoming a caregiver. You know, I had this, you know, it's a bias, it's a social bias when you think of a caregiver and you think of all of these stories and how constrained your world becomes. But that doesn't necessarily affect your networks. The subjective experience might be that they're constrained, but there are these networks that are sort of embedded in. And the question becomes, how can we harness these networks so that when they have something that dominates the before and after, that they're still able to maintain those ties that can give them the resources and the help that they need.
Thank you. Great question. I totally agree with you. I think it's important for us to start looking at undocumented immigrant population as a case and how different the aging process works for them compared to documented immigrants and response citizens. But right now, like as I showed, like we don't have that many observations in a sample to be able to do a very strong and robust comparison. We also don't have that many people in the different aging cohorts, because 65 at the end of the day is kind of like an arbitrary threshold, right? That's why I think it was part of the inspiration for the policy in California to expand it to 50 and older, because we know that the aging process works differently for different individuals. So I think that was the right choice, because a lot of the type of jobs that undocumented immigrants have are dangerous, are strenuous, and they experience very poor access to healthcare. When they do have insurance, they face unstable insurance or very limited coverage. So by the time that the undocumented immigrants age, when they actually need more health coverage, the needs are higher, their health outcomes are, I would hypothesize, worse. And I think that based on that very preliminary descriptive analysis that I have done, it suggests that that's the case. Like, you see what are like the main reported measures of health among the undocumented. They, as I summarize my presentation, they are likely to be much worse reported health than the US citizen population. So once we start to like build up in that research, in the nuance to see what type of different comorbidities, how they treat these comorbidities, how they react to uncontrolled chronic conditions, then we will be able to characterize better how different the aging process works between the citizens. But right now, I think we're just at the onset of this new way of doing research. As I mentioned in my presentation, if these present trends continue and we start to see immigrants age, as particularly documented, we will definitely need the information to inform clinicians, to inform administrators, and to inform policymakers about.
I just wanted to make a comment, especially my Diana's paper, where there's this sort of underlying theme about size, population size, sample size, but there's also this underlying theme about the translation piece, the language piece. And one of the challenges about doing stuff with working in another language, whether it's Spanish or an indigenous population, is that you bump up against the labor that's involved with translating, and the mistaken notion that a translation that is tossed into Google Translate and you get like word for word translation, it's not exactly capturing meanings. And so a lot of our measures that we're using, that we're taking for granted, are sort of that, it used to be that you have a measure and you translate it, and ideally back translate it. You throw something into Google and you throw it back and you get the same thing, but that doesn't necessarily capture the meaning when it goes from one language medium to another. And so we're using measures around cognition, and some of them have been validated in Spanish, and some of them are adapted and not necessarily adapted or been validated and are being used because they're being used as the translations. And so it raises a lot of questions. And when you're in a nation that really does not understand the complexity of dealing with one language in the context of a very English dominant. And so I understand, I can imagine what your feedback is, and I really appreciate it.
Just very quickly, I can actually provide some example for that, for that call for action. I actually once I did a study for small grant about a Leuven social isolation scale. It's something similar to social isolation. And yeah, when I did the score just translated, the understanding of what I was asking was so different to when I actually did a proper validation of the Leuven social isolation score. So it's very important when we even do that research to see whether the different surveys were just translated or actually validated to be culturally appropriate, because results tend to be very dramatic.
Thank you, everybody.
Sorry, I'm just going to set up this first center. Wasn't looking where I was going. Okay, lightning presentations now. So Gucci areas.
So yeah, maybe we can put it up already.
Yeah, I'll just get it ready. Just get that ready.
Yes, good. Excellent.
I'm just gonna leave it now.
I'm going to keep the ring.
So Fernando is going to do it or Jack's going to do it?
Okay. So Fernando, take it away.
Oh, Lisette is here.
Oh.
Okay, sorry, I was
Sorry.
You need a just a quick thing.
Jackie, you want to do the first one?
Hello, everyone. Do you want to get a gift? If yes, pay attention here.
Jackie, you want to do the first one? Yeah, you do. All right. As you can see, we have a couple of, can people hear me in the back? Yeah, okay, sorry, I can't hear myself. I guess this will help. So we have a few, we're gonna do a kind of a, we have some gifts. We have a gift pack for someone that, you know, normally we do the ICAs around a particular time of the year. So there are a couple of right answers to this question, but you know, about a celebration of different things around now. So if people want to raise their hand and say, what are we celebrating around this time of the year, this day or tomorrow, you'll get a prize. Yes. Yes. Mexican Independence Day is right. Congratulations. And on the other side of the border, relatedly, another celebration around this time of the year. Yes, we have a second winner. Ding, 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 ding. All right. The lady sitting behind Miguel Arce, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Okay, and then, yes, and then, we have one more? No, she answered the, oh, answered the second one. Yes, all right. Okay, thank you for the intermission. Now we're back to regular programming.
We move from one lightning round to another lightning round. So those of you who've been a part of ICA over the past decade or so, you know that one of the things that makes ICA special is our commitment to mentoring the next generation of scholars. And this shouldn't be surprising. It's already been commented on. If you look around at the leaders of this conference series, you see some of the best mentors that you will ever see. People that are committed to building dynasties and supporting the next generation of scholars. So I know everyone's getting tired, but I want to encourage you over the next couple of hours to embrace this sacred commitment to the next generation of scholars and listen and support the next generation of scholars in this next paper session. And when you visit the posters in the background, let's be supportive and encouraging, you know, of our junior scholars, and that's what I wanted to say. So let's get started with our lightning presentations here. Before I do that, I did want to acknowledge briefly the people that were involved in reviewing the poster submissions and developing the lightning round. First and foremost, Adriana Reyes was the main leader of the mentoring sessions this year. Thank you very much, Adriana. Emma Aguilar was also very helpful, USC, and David Marquez. Thank you very much for your service this year. Thank you. And so I will introduce the first speaker, Angela Gutierrez. Please join me up here.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Awesome. Buenas tardes, everybody. So my name is Angela Gutierrez, and today I'll be giving a talk on rural-urban healthcare cost differences among Latinx adults with and without dementia, implications for resilience. So the Latinx population is the largest ethnic minoritized group in the US, and since 2010, also the largest ethnic minoritized group in rural America. And yet there's a dearth of research on Latinx adults in rural America. So what do we know among this population? We know that Latinx adults in rural America relative to non-Latinx whites are less likely to have access to medical care and health insurance, also have fewer physician visits, and they tend to have more emergency department visits, which ultimately leads to higher costs in the long term. And now thinking about rurality and dementia status among Latinx adults, and how specifically in rural counties, we see that the incidence of dementia is higher, yet the prevalence of dementia is lower than urban areas. And we also see that among rural residents, they tend to be diagnosed with dementia at younger ages, and they tend to have a shorter time to death, about 6 months after dementia diagnosis relative to their urban counterparts. And given that Latinx adults have a greater risk of developing dementia and have an earlier onset of dementia about 7 years earlier than non-Hispanic whites, we see that this can be a serious problem when it comes to looking at the intersection between Latinx adults who live in rural areas. So overall, I've seen 3 key gaps in the literature. The first is that rural-urban differences in healthcare costs are unclear. Overall, research in this area has generally looked at rural-urban differences in access to care. And so that research has been really important in documenting distinct barriers for accessing needed care. However, when it comes to looking at rural-urban differences in healthcare costs, that is an area that's been understudied. And in particular, it's been understudied among the Latinx population. So prior research in this area has generally controlled for race and ethnicity. And once again, if we control for race ethnicity, we're likely obscuring several important patterns, just like we see within and across group differences for distinct health outcomes. There may be some interesting patterns that are being masked when it comes to healthcare cost. And the third gap is that data over time and across the US are needed. And in particular, research in this area has typically used cross-sectional or regional data. And although these have been able to provide unique insights in their own, by using data over time and by looking at a sample across the US, that would provide additional insights. And so with these gaps in mind, we developed 2 research questions. The first is, are there rural-urban healthcare cost differences among Latinx adults in the US? And what we hypothesize is that rural residents would have higher total and out-of-pocket cost than their urban counterparts. The second question that we raised was, does the geographic context healthcare relationship vary between those with and without dementia? In other words, is dementia status an effect modifier in this focal relationship? And so we hypothesize that rural residents with dementia would have the highest healthcare costs. So now thinking about what we actually did, our methods. We used data from the Health and Retirement Study, and in particular, we used the 2006 to 2018 waves. And we restricted analyses to Latinx adults who are 51 years and older, which resulted in an analytic sample of about 15,567 adults. So drawing on Lawton's theory of ecology on aging, we looked at the direct association between geographic context and healthcare cost. And specifically for healthcare cost, we differentiated between total healthcare cost and out-of-pocket healthcare cost. We then looked at whether dementia status was an effect modifier in this focal relationship. And to assess geographic context, we used the bio-rural-urban continuum codes to classify as either urban or rural. For healthcare costs, we used the Consumer Price Index to inflate all dollar amounts to 2021 values. And for dementia status, we use the Lang-Aware classification. And in particular, we combine those who are cognitively normal and those who have cognitively impaired non-dementia with, and ended up comparing those with persons with dementia. For all analyses, we went ahead and controlled for socio-demographic and health characteristics. And now in terms of the actual analysis, we used multivariable generalized linear regression models. And to address the repeated measures in our pooled cross-sectional data, we used GEE with a participant year unit. And because there was a large proportion of participants who had not incurred any healthcare cost, we used a binomial distribution for those who had no healthcare cost. And we used a gamma distribution for those who did have healthcare cost. So now jumping into the results and starting off with participant characteristics. Over half the sample were female. Almost 2/3 were born in the US. And the majority lived in urban areas. That should say like 89%, I believe, were urban. And so as a reminder, back to research question number 1. Are there rural-urban healthcare cost differences among Latinx adults in the US? And we found evidence that yes, there were significant differences. So here is, we're depicting the total healthcare cost between rural and urban areas. And rural residents have statistically significant higher total healthcare cost than their urban counterparts. And specifically, they paid about $850 more annually. And overall, we saw the same pattern when we looked at out-of-pocket cost in this slide now. And so rural residents overall paid an estimated $870 more than their urban counterparts in out-of-pocket cost. And so now jumping into the second research question, which was basically looking at the interaction between geographic context and dementia status. And overall, we found no evidence of any statistically significant interactions between the two. Even then, I still want to show you a graph here just for illustrating some of the trends that we saw. And here are the out-of-pocket cost of care by geographic context and dementia status. And once again, these are not statistically significant results, but interestingly, we see that there was a trend where those who live in rural areas and do not have dementia had incurred the most out-of-pocket cost. So now thinking about the key takeaways of the study. The first is that rural residents have higher total healthcare costs than their urban counterparts. And overall, this diverges from prior research. Prior research has typically not found significant rural-urban differences in healthcare cost. When we look at research that has been done in this area, we see that in some of their initial models, you'll see significant differences. And once they control for several other factors, those are diminished. But once again, these studies controlled for race and ethnicity. And so our study differs in that we're looking specifically among Latinx adults in rural and urban settings. Another key takeaway is that rural residents also had higher out-of-pocket costs than their urban counterparts. And this is consistent with prior research among privately insured US residents. So given that there's very limited research in this area, we did find a study among privately insured US residents. And what was interesting about the study is that they compared rural residents who were furthest from urban areas and compared that with rural residents who were close to urban areas and then those who are in urban areas. And overall, they found that rural residents who are furthest away from urban areas had the highest out-of-pocket cost, which again just underscores the particular disadvantage and high burden of these costs for those who are in rural and isolated areas. And finally, the key takeaway is that there were no statistically significant interactions between geographic context and dementia status on healthcare cost. We were surprised to see this as it's not what we had hypothesized. And prior research shows that individuals with dementia incur higher healthcare costs than those without dementia. And also keeping in mind that dementia costs are not consistent over the years. Generally, they're highest the first year after dementia diagnosis. But then when we're thinking about our population at hand, Latinx adults, we see that Latinx adults tend to develop dementia earlier than non-Hispanic whites, and also they tend to live longer with dementia than non-Hispanic whites. So just thinking about how in our study, we're looking at a population who likely has a very different health profile than non-Hispanic whites, for example. And something that we didn't tap into that is a limitation and something to consider is the unmet needs of these folks. And in particular, we see that rural residents with dementia, they did not incur the highest healthcare cost. And interestingly, that brings to mind literature that talks about rural residents being geographically isolated, having fewer specialty services, and having higher rates of poverty. And so the interaction of these and how they potentially are barriers for these individuals accessing the care that they need. So overall, this study is able to document the disproportionately high burden of healthcare among rural relative to urban Latinx adults. And findings also underscore the larger geographic context in shaping opportunities and/or constraints for resilience and healthy aging. So when we think of resilience research, many times we can focus on psychosocial factors, interpersonal factors, but also keeping in mind how the larger structural factors and geographic context, how they also importantly shape resilience opportunities. And finally, this research looks at basically the intersection of three groups who are generally understudied and overlooked in research. Those rural residents, persons with dementia, and the Latinx population. And findings clarify how rurality confers healthcare disadvantage for Latinx adults. In terms of next steps, it would be important to look at the heterogeneity of rural areas, to look at unmet needs of rural residents and persons with dementia, and to look at variations across Latinx subgroups. And I just want to say thank you to the Michigan Center for Contextual Factors on Alzheimer's Disease and the folks here at the International Conference on Aging in the Americas, and happy to chat here or through email. Thank you.
Sorry. Just get the next please. I have to. Wondering why I have two presentations there. You just need to right click to go to the next slide.
And our next speaker is Felipe Antequera.
Thank you very much. Okay, our research it's about the impact of ethnic enclaves on the life space mobility for the oldest Mexican Americans. I want to begin acknowledging and thanking and giving a thank you to the team that was part of this research, Dr. Phil Cantu, who supervised and collaborated on all this research from University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston, Dr. Jackie Angel from the University of Texas at Austin, and Dr. Soham Alsni, also from the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston. And also I want to thank and I want to acknowledge that this work was supported by the National Institute of Aging project grants that are mentioned there. Okay, so the motivation for this research to start, we know that mobility limitation can be related to social isolation. And this is a risk factor related to higher mortality levels, to depression, to healthcare use, and other consequences. We also know that ethnic enclaves are a protective, community for health among all the Latinos. Just a reminder, the ethnic enclaves, right, are the geographic areas with a high concentration of ethnic population, right? And they are usually, they present a very particular cultural identity. And we know also that high concentration of poverty is related to lower life space mobility levels. So we know all this, but there is little known about the role that ethnic enclaves have in the relationship between the poverty and the life space mobility. Before we move on, I want to explain what is life space mobility, right? Maybe some of you are familiar with the concept. For those who are not, life space mobility, or LSM, it's a concept for assessing the older person's capacity and ability and patterns of functional mobility, okay? How a person is able to move outside their bedroom, within their house, outside their house, around their neighborhood, around their city, and outside their cities. The instrument, the most important instrument developed to assess, to measure life space mobility is the life space assessment instrument, which measures the level, these different levels that we see here, the frequency and the level of assistance that a person needs to move around, okay? This was developed by the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And we have research that shows that life space assessment instruments can accurately predict morbidity, mortality, and healthcare use. But again, as I said before, there's no research or very little research today that has examined the role of ethnic enclaves in the life space mobility of older adults. So our proposition is that based on previous research that we know that there is a negative relationship between life space mobility and poverty. And we also know that there is a positive relationship between general health and ethnic enclaves. So using census tract percentage of Mexican American population as a proxy for ethnic enclaves, we expect to find that the higher concentrations of Mexican American population in a census tract will mitigate, will have an effect in the relationship between poverty and life space mobility. What is the data that we use? First of all, we use the census data from 2010 to collect the census percentage track of poverty, and also to collect the percentage of Mexican American. And also we use the EPSI, the Hispanic Established Populations for the Epidemiologic Study of the Elderly, wave number 7, also from year 2010 and 11, with a number of 1,078 participants between 75 and 102 years old. Also from the EPSI, we have all the battery, all the questions to calculate the life space assessment. We have the socio-demographic characteristics and the medical conditions of all the participants in this way. For the analysis, we started calculating the life space assessment total score, which was not provided, but we had all the information to compute this, so it was the basic and first step. Then we classified the percentage, the people, the participants by quintiles, percentage of poverty quintiles and percentage of Mexican American quintiles. We calculated covariance distribution by quintiles of poverty and Mexican American populations. I'm gonna show you that in the next slide if I'm not wrong. And we perform ANOVA and chi-square test to test the independence of all the covariates and these two variables, the percentage of poverty and the percentage of Mexican Americans. And finally, we did multiple regression to see the relationship between poverty and life space assessment and see how the inclusion in the models of percentage of Mexican American can influence this relation. So for the results, we have here the graphs that show the demographic and the health characteristic by poverty quintiles. So we see here 5 poverty quintiles, right? And some of the demographic characteristics, like age, we divided the people into group age, younger than 85 and older or equal than 85 years old. We see the gender, the marital status, and the language of interview. And this is the distribution for each of the quintiles, okay? So we see, for example, if we see the yellow bars, we see that most of the people, sorry, not most of the people, around 30% of the people are married, right? And we wanted to show here that those variables are independent from the percentage of poverty. So we want to see some kind of even distribution. The only one that was not that even is the blue one that you see that is like a slight increment, right? And we did the same for the health conditions per poverty quintile. I'm not showing all the results because, you know, there were too much, but also we see the quintiles and we see the distribution of activities of daily living in the blue bars. The orange shows the depression, right? And we see like some kind of even distribution among each quintile, which is what we expect, so they can be independent. Same analysis for the percentage of Mexican American population quintiles. And we see, again, similar trends. There is not much variation and a similar distribution among the different quintiles of the socio-demographic characteristics and also for the health conditions, okay? Of course, the quintiles change, and these are indicated in the axis. Oh, that is very blurry, but you can trust me. We can share that. It's on the website. As for the regression results, so we conducted 5 models regressing life space assessment on poverty, and then we included the social demographic, the health characteristics, the percentage of Mexican American, which was, you know, our interest. Here I'm presenting part of the results. I bet this is too small to watch, so I'm gonna mention. The first one is the percentage of poverty, our main variable, right? Used to regress a life space assessment. And we are comparing model 3, which includes, on the left is model 3, the social demographic and the health covariates. And then in the model 4, we included the percentage of Mexican American. So that was our important comparison here. What happens once we include the Mexican American percentage in our model? The most important result here is that the percentage of poverty was affected. And it was from significant, it went to be non-significant, and also was reduced by more than 40%. The age, for example, it didn't change much. And this is another graph just because the scale was kind of different. I presented in two parts, but it's the same comparison. Model 3 before including percentage of Mexican American, and Model 4 when we included. And we see here some of the health coverages, like activities of daily living, depressive symptoms, cognitive impairment, and the physical performance. And none of these variables change dramatically. Most of them presented changes lower than 5%. The only one that changed, and as we expected, was the percentage of poverty. So for the discussion, first of all, we see that we are confirming here results of other studies that show that high concentration of poverty is negatively associated with the life space assessment. So we are providing additional evidence for previous studies. And also what I just mentioned, that all other coverages present a minimum variation when we adding the percentage of Mexican American. And this is additional evidence for the positive effect of the protective network that represents the social dynamics among Mexican American population in ethnic enclaves. Also, what are the policy implications of these results? The policy implications are related to the promotion and the construction of stronger networks and provide services via organizations and other institutions that are focused in the older populations to take advantage of this positive and the protective effect of health among older Latino populations living in ethnic enclaves. So when we identify ethnic enclaves, we know that we can provide, additional policies and support to these enclaves. And finally, we are contributing to the Age-Friendly Cities and Communities Initiative. This is a program that is part of the Age-Friendly Initiative, Age-Friendly Agenda that is promoted for the World Health Organization that aims to integrate the older populations into the broader community. And also we are providing, an additional contribution to understand and to expand the concept of aging in place, which maybe most of you are familiar with this term that is widely used in aging policy. And it relates that with the promotion of a connection and the feelings of security and the familiarity between older populations and their families and their houses. Well, that is my presentation. Thank you so much.
Our last presentation for the lightning presentation will be delivered by Jennifer Archuleta.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student from UCLA. And I'm here to present a project that I worked on with my collaborator. Esmeralda is one of them who's in the audience here with us today. And I'd also like to recognize our mentor, Iram Beltran Sanchez, for his mentorship and support with this and many other projects. I would also like to dedicate this to Professor Steve Wallace. He was one of my professors at UCLA and one of my inspirations to pursue this field. And I miss him very much and hope that whatever work that I move forward in his honor will help future generations of aging adults. And second, I would also like to dedicate this work to my grandma Viola Rivera, who unfortunately passed away from complications due to dementia. And it's a very important topic that I've been further inspired to hear all of you talk about in your important work, because it's a very tough disease to deal with on the front lines. So thank you again for all of your work and contribution to this field. Just some background and a formal definition of dementia. It's a disease that's characterized by cognitive impairment that affects memory, communication, behavior, and affects activities of daily living. It's experienced by about 8.8% of individuals aged 65 and older in the US. However, the Latinx population is expected to experience the largest increase in the next 40 years, about a 6-fold increase in dementia cases. And this is a particular concern since Latinx older adults have limited access already to quality healthcare and formal support for dementia, and that can impact future diagnosis and follow-up healthcare utilization. And given that COVID-19 pandemic has happened relatively recently, little is known about its effect on healthcare use among Latinx older adults with a dementia diagnosis. Therefore, we have 2 research aims. The first is to describe dementia trends in 2019 among Latinx older adults, and the second is to describe differences in their access to healthcare during the coronavirus pandemic. We use data from the National Health and Aging Trends Study, or NHATS. We've first used the 2019 sample, which had about 35,000 participants. And in 2020, they introduced a COVID-19 supplement that discussed questions directly related to the experience of healthcare during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there were about 4,000 participants in that sample. One thing to note is that this sample includes only Medicare beneficiaries aged 65 and older. So we do recognize that we miss out on a considerable portion of the population that don't of older adults that do not have Medicare for some reason. And we also restricted our sample to community dwelling older adults as opposed to those who live in nursing home facilities. I gave a brief definition of dementia, but how we operationalized it in this study is we acquired self-reported questions and cognitive tests from NHATS to come up with 3 categories that people were placed in for our analysis. So they were either considered as having normal cognition, possible dementia, and probable dementia. In our linear regression analysis, we focused on the population that responded to having possible or probable dementia. And for the interest of time, I won't go too much into the measures, but they were based off of test scores in 3 domains, which included executive functioning, orientation, and memory. The first step in our analytic approach was to create descriptive data in terms of sociodemographics in the 2019 data set and in the 2020 data set. And then we used weighted F tests to analyze differences between Latinx older adults and white participants. Last, we used linear probability models to estimate probability of 3 different variables related to healthcare utilization, which I'll discuss in a future slide. And covariates we used were age, gender, race, ethnicity, marital status, and income. Here are 3 outcome variables. The first, well, they were all binary variables in response to yes or no questions. The first asked participants whether they had put off care or whether they had intended to seek care but had put it off during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second asked whether they used help from a caregiver and within their social network to communicate with or visit a provider. And the third asked whether or not they had a hospital stay within the past 12 months. Really briefly, the results from each survey in terms of racial composition and dementia prevalence showed that they were pretty much the same, even though the sample sizes differed significantly. It was 35,000 versus 4,000, but they were about the same, with the sample consisting of about 7% Latinx, 9% Black, and 82% white. As far as the breakdown for dementia status, we see that about 83% had normal cognition, while 10% had possible dementia and 6% had probable dementia. When we stratified by race ethnicity in the 2019 descriptives, we found that relative to the white participants, there were more Latinx participants that had lower income, and they were also more likely to have a past year hospital visit, and they also had a higher likelihood of probable and possible dementia by quite a bit. It was about 3 times as many Latinx adults with probable dementia compared to, so about 17% compared to about 5% of white adults in our sample. And similar with possible dementia, with 24% versus 8%. And in 2020, when we looked at our descriptive stratified analyses between Latinx and white adults, we find similar trends where Latinx have lower income and higher likelihood of having probable and possible dementia. In this table, we show our 3 outcome variables and the descriptive breakdown of that, also stratified by race ethnicity. And we see overall, there's only significant differences by having help with from a caregiver with visiting a provider. So that difference was about 38% for Latinx older adults and 15% amongst non-Latinx white adults with dementia. And as far as putting off care during COVID-19, both groups respond about 40% to having that issue, whereas about 17-18% of the overall group reported having a hospital visit in the past 12 months during the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, here are linear regression results. And each column represents each of our variables that we were modeling. So first, when we look at adults that had put off care due to the pandemic, we see significant results by Latinx and Black participants that shows that they were most likely to put off care compared to their white counterparts during the pandemic. In terms of having some caregiver help with seeing a provider during the pandemic, we find that Latinx and by older age group, there are significant differences in receiving help, and also having a hospital stay in the past 12 months was only significant by older age groups. This is a continuation of the previous table, but looks at marital status and income. There weren't very many significant results, except really we see that widows have a lower likelihood of putting off care compared to married participants. And then just to summarize key findings for interest of time, we saw that when we compare the 2020 versus the 2019 composition, they were both similar in terms of demographics, and overall about 17% of adults reported having possible or probable dementia. And when we compare differences by Latinx and white older adults, we saw that Latinx had lower income, higher rates of dementia, more hospital stays only in the 2019 sample, and they also received more help with visiting a provider. Finally, in our regression models, we saw that Latinx older adults with dementia were the group that were most likely to both put off care while receiving more help from a caregiver with seeing providers. And last of all, older age was associated with both receiving help with the provider and having a past year hospital stay during 2020. In conclusion, we would need to obtain more information, hopefully outside of just Medicare beneficiaries, in order to understand why older adults are putting off care. And this is an important issue, as we can see that the Latinx population relies a lot on caregivers for receiving support with visiting and communicating with their providers. And as we've heard in previous presentations, caregiver health is also important within the Latinx population, as they're a very integral part of the entire healthcare of aging adults. And last, as the population of older Latinx adults is increasing in this country, it's important to address for future increase in demand for dementia-related services and the increasing costs of care. Thank you so much for your time.
We have time for a couple of questions for our lighting panel. If the authors want to come up, the last presenters would come up here. Thank you. Questions from the audience? Make them come up here for no reason. Come on. All right, please. It's your show.
Well, first, like, this is the most exciting part of the event because this is the mentoring part of the event. And I remember me sitting there. So it's like, you know, it's good to see how things move in our careers and lives. So first, congratulations on your great work, all of the three of you. But I have a question for Josefina. Do you have any variable that is like if someone in the household had COVID? Because when you think about the results that you have, for example, they had help to go see a provider, but they put off care, right? So like maybe they had to seek if there was someone in the household. So I was wondering if you can include or if there is a variable, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Also, Josefina is the first author, but
Sorry.
the second author, Jennifer.
Sorry, Jennifer.
No, it's fine. So, yeah, I think that would have been an interesting variable to control for. I haven't looked too much in depth in the whole COVID 2020 supplement for that year, but if they did ask, or if they did not ask a question on whether or not someone in the household had COVID, I would be very surprised because I'm sure that would play a great role in whether or not someone's able to visit their older adult relative, given that it's a contagious disease and they're at high risk of contracting the illness. So that would decrease their level of support. So I'd have to go back and look in the supplement to see if they asked that. But if they did, I think that would be an excellent variable to control for in future analysis.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for fantastic presentations. I have a question for you. I don't remember your name yet. Yeah, Felipe. It's about, you know, you presented fantastic work on LSA, and I wonder whether you had the opportunity or have given any thoughts about potential association or correlation between LSA and MCR, motoric cognitive risk concept. This idea that, I don't know, are you familiar with it?
I'm not familiar, so if you can describe.
Yeah, it's like, so MCR is motoric cognitive risk, and it's when individuals have low gait speed and subjective cognitive complaints. So when you were presenting, the first thing that came to my mind was, well, perhaps there's something there that you can look into how these two concepts may relate or may be associated, or
yeah,
so,
I mean, for sure. We included several health coverages, and I think one alternative could be like including that also, because we saw how activities of daily living, for example, have an impact, but then when we control and when we added the percentage of Mexican American, that didn't change. So it's interesting to see, you know, this new variable and how it's going to be their behavior after we control, after we include in our model the percentage of Mexican American. For sure, that is a great follow-up study into, I mean, I think it shouldn't be very hard after what we develop, because we have very clear models. So including this variable, maybe individually or if within the group of health coverages, will be a great follow-up.
I think that if you have the data to derive MCR, then you can easily.
Yeah, and for sure, I think what we could expect is that it's going to have a negative impact and it's going to reduce the ability of people in their mobility assessment. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a great set of presentations. I found, Angela, your talk very interesting. And I was wondering if for the results of rural versus urban, did you have any information of the number of chronic conditions that individuals had and if that differed by rural and urban? And I was thinking maybe that could potentially contribute to the differential costs of healthcare use.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, thank you. So we did actually include like a whole discussion of that in the discussion section. We're trying to speculate why is it that we found these results. And off the top of my head, I'm not remembering what the patterns of health conditions look like between the two groups, but I do know that generally those in rural areas have poor health outcomes than those in urban areas. So I would expect that we're seeing patterns like that. We did go for several, what was available. So we looked at the 10 leading causes of death among Latinx adults, and of those available in the HRS, we controlled for them, but there are several that we didn't control for, which made the payroll.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I was having a conversation with a colleague, and he was talking about the living conditions too are so different, and there's not a lot of oversight into keeping housing up to code in rural versus urban, and how that can contribute to more exposures to toxic things. I don't know. So yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
And even just thinking about what it means to be in a rural area, and so it isn't always operationalize it. It can be just by destinations using like the field border continuum. It can also be looking at the percentage living in rural areas of the county, and so. And even then, just like we saw one study that differentiated between rural areas who are furthest from urban areas versus not. So there's a lot of nuances.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Great presentation. So I just wanted to say first, congratulations. It is very exciting, as I was some years ago also part of a similar panel. So it's great to see that you guys are doing excellent work. So I really like all your presentations. A quick question also for Jennifer. In your models, what I saw in the data that you had, I didn't see any indicators of a household composition. And from what we know and what we have heard today, some of the healthcare usually happens within the family. And this is perhaps important for dementia or this type of cognitive decline. In the particular case that you are studying with Latino populations, I would imagine these older adults perhaps might live in extended family households, which would be quite different from non-Latinx whites. So I just wonder if you have given any thought of adding or have thought about it, perhaps including something along those lines.
Thank you for your question. That's an excellent question. I think that originally our idea for this project was going towards more of the caregiver route, so that would include following certain participants that lived within the same household as the older adult participant. However, that data was confidential and would take some time to acquire, but we did consider it would have just been more time consuming to access that private data. But they do have indicators not only on the number of household members, but also variables related to their health status too. So yeah, if anyone's interested in the NHAPS survey, it was really helpful if you're interested specifically with regard to caregiving. But yeah, I agree that composition is very important in these types of outcomes.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question, and I'm going to ask the question. Angela, I saw that interaction didn't work out the way you expected it. If you could do it over again, if you could do your study over again, do you think you would have pursued that? Have you, after you've seen the analysis, have you maybe rethought, the model that you pursued in any way? Because this happens to us all. Sometimes we pursue models, they don't work out, and then we rethink our models. Have you had any thoughts, had time to think about that?
I think the finding that we didn't see any significant interaction itself is important to just try and understand, well, what are the factors and what is the difference between incurring these different costs versus
think it was helpful in just thinking through the bigger picture, which is, well, how can we actually move towards capturing and addressing the needs of these individuals? And so we do definitely have some future work that does want to tap into. Now looking at the needs of rural Latinx adults and capturing some of these very specific nuances. And we could basically picture this as a first step. Thank you.
Thank you all. 2 quick announcements. We're about to enter into our next break. After our break, I just wanted to please invite you to join our poster session where